Chapter 1 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 1. We hit upon the same thought at precisely the same instant, my wife and I, as we started home from Julia's. Coming out from the gloomy driveway and turning to the right along the main road, the night a bit wild with wind and the moonlight hitting the earth hard through rifts in the racing cloud, my wife spoke the words with me. How gay she was after all! Such little happenings are not always so mysterious as they seem. In this case there was cause enough for us to hit upon the same thought at the same moment, a mournful spirit always walking in the driveway to the house in which Julia and Eric lived. And that night Eric was away and Julia was alone in the place. Many a time before, having left them together in the dark house behind, my wife and I half sighed with relief as we came up from the blackness under the hemlocks that roofed the driveway and gained the flat high road, bare of trees and blessedly free under sun, stars, or cloud from lugubrious shadows. We had often spoken of the melancholy that breathed round the house and grounds, puzzled to explain it since Eric was warm-hearted and cordial, and Julia had a way with her that put guests at their ease, and they adored each other. Perhaps he loved her too intensely. I have since thought of that. His very ardor of attention, maybe, put it into our subconsciousness that he was protecting her against, well, anything. You see, it was easy enough to fill the black shadows under those old hemlocks with menaces to the welfare of Eric and Julia, and since many others felt as we felt about the place, though not so keenly, I suppose, the stimulus to the imagination must have been something that was evident to all the friends who visited the house. Nothing therein was so evident as Eric's restless and forever protecting love of his wife. After spending an evening with him and her, one might well shiver with fear lest something harm her and hence drive him mad. The black shadows under those trees could easily secrete wickedness. To those who knew Eric and Julia less intimately than we, I am aware that this will appear a little far-fetched. There was a very noticeable element of tenderness in him which might belie what, for the sake of my argument, I must call his alertness, as against an inexorable hostility. Then, too, wives who attract a jealous watchfulness from their husbands usually suggest the possibility of evasion, a fleeing over the traces. But Julia loved Eric with a love that would, and did, go through hellfire unchanged. He was wholly sure of her love. We all were. I think no one lost sight of that, even when to some it could not but seem that his presence was to her a source of... well, let that go for the present. It was natural enough for my wife and me to ejaculate at the same moment the surprising fact that Julia, alone in the gloomy house save for a grouchy servant, and with Eric gone from her for the first time since they had been married, had seemed unusually gay. Perhaps I should say gay as she used to be in the first days when we knew her. We had feared that she might be sadly depressed by his absence. As we drove home that night, we recalled to each other, in phrases snatched from our lips by the gale, Eric's sorrow at being forced to leave her, even for the brief space of 2 weeks. Lately she had not been well. Her delicately colored face had slowly been losing its color, and its delicate lines were being drawn, especially about the eyes, in which both Annette and I had observed from time to time a look of apprehension. Sleeplessness might have made her look so. Just before Eric went away, she had come to walk with a certain weariness, and Annette, naturally a keener observer than I, had declared to me that Julia struck her as a woman beset by nervousness at night and exhausted by day. While all this was slighter than my words about it, it was real enough for Eric to feel that Julia should not accompany him on a tiresome business trip, and though Julia dreaded being separated from him, she evidently recognized the wisdom of her staying quietly at home while he was gone.
"I cannot bear the thought of his leaving me, and I want most dreadfully to go with him," she told Annette. "But, well, I am a little run down, and we both think I had better not try it. After all," she went on with a half-sad smile, "we simply are two persons, and we can't always be with each other."
And then she added with a surprisingly different tone, which Annette could neither describe nor reproduce,
"We must be sensible, yes, sensible, reasonable."
When we got home that night, when I had filled my pipe, and Annette, plumper than the berry since the baby was born, had kicked off her slippers, and we sat down for a little chat together before going upstairs to bed. It was the very reasonableness of Eric and Julia that we agreed upon. Though, I remarked judicially, I should think Eric would have sent her to pass the time of his absence in some more cheerful place. That would have been the wholly sensible thing to do.
"What more have you ever learned of that house, Pierre?"
my wife asked me by way of rejoinder. She had set me once to find out something. We felt the place had almost a personality, not, as you will have gleaned, one wholly pleasant to us. But that may not have been entirely because of its spookiness. I am an American, and I am a chauvinist enough, is that the word? To be prejudiced in favor of a new concrete house. As for Annette, with 2 children to safeguard, she's all for the up-to-date in ventilation, plumbing, and orientation. Thorsby, where we lived, was being built of houses of the kind that are put up quickly and that last, theoretically, should last, long. Most of them had not been built long enough as yet to test the boast of architects and promoters that they had called for next to no repairs. While they were cheap, they were good, and they were blessedly clean and full of sun and air. Thorsby was a settlement of commuters, most of them well enough off to own an automobile, few of them rich enough to hire a chauffeur. There were perhaps 20 young married couples bringing up their infants there. We hadn't yet much of a community spirit, but such a thing was beginning to crystallize around the general need. We all had babies growing rapidly in the way of nature, for schools. You see, there had never been a village of Thorsby. The Common Sense Realty Company, specially incorporated under the laws of New York, had bought up some 10 square miles of land on the high plateau above the river, had drained the swampy places, laid out a few rods, cut down the moth-eaten trees, and marked off the terrain into generous house lots. The name Thorsby had come from the maternal grandfather of the up-and-coming young man whose brain had engendered the Common Sense Realty Company. He was Bob Planter. We had him to dinner once, Annette and I, and took to him wholeheartedly. Like all young American businessmen, he had an eye out for the money in the scheme. But equally like them, let me say like us, he had a sort of glorious inspiration, and dreamed of the future of the place, and loved planning for it. Saw it all in the rosy light of enthusiastic yet common-sense youth. After all, the United States of America were born in a clearing, and they've cleared the way before them as they've grown. If to me there's a romance about a brand-new cement house and a bare, flat plot of land, it's because I've inherited the forward-looking temperament from my grandfathers. I write this by way of gentle protest, because I remember that Annette's second cousin, Giles Farrow, a gifted but temperamental artist, was staying with us the night young Planter came to dinner, and that he called Thorsby hopeless, naked, new, and American. Why, of course American. But that was the very reason it wasn't hopeless. Nothing could down Planter's enthusiasm, but on the other hand, nothing could soften my wife's cousin's resentment. Meadow grasses were beautiful. Find a way to kill off mosquitoes, but keep your meadows. You can restore moth-eaten trees and protect them from pests in the future. But drain your meadows and cut down all your trees. You take all natural charm and individuality from the place. "Well," replied Planter with unperturbed good humor, "the sun still sets in the west, over the river, and we have grand sunsets, my friend." Giles paid no more attention to him than if he had not spoken. "Take that old place behind the hemlocks, back in on the river 3 miles or so up," he went on. "That has charm, softness, atmosphere." Atmosphere. I shudder now when I think of that place. But I remember that then Planter laughed heartily at picking as a model for the Common Sense Realty Company such a broken-down old wooden house, all squat and dark on the edge of a precipice down to the river one way, and shut off from the sun and the rest of the world by a bunch of damp and half-rotten old evergreens the other. It was that same night I learned my first about the house. I myself had never laid eyes on it, but my wife's cousin, walking in a fever of wounded susceptibilities, and dragging my wife along with him, had made a beeline out of the squarely planned and flat Thorsby, on across the fields towards a clump of trees on a distant headland that jutted out into the river. Having reached these, they pushed their way through and came upon the wooden house. It was, as Planter said, built on the very edge of the cliff. On all but the river side, it was surrounded by a thicket of hemlocks, which had been set out not more than 50 feet from the house itself. Planter had penetrated the thicket in the early days of the Thorsby survey, and had found the narrow bit of land between the house and the trees overgrown with tall grass, weeds, and thistles. He had found the house broken down, sashes without glass, shutters dangling from one hinge, sections of the gutters fallen askew, and the paint peeled off. But my wife and her cousin had found a smooth lawn, a house which seemed to be in good repair, and a charming lady and a lanky, low-voiced gentleman evidently living there, tying up foxgloves in bloom along the southern wall. Since the afternoon of that chance encounter, both my wife and I had become intimate with Eric and Julia Greer, and had grown really to love them. But to both of us the house had remained rather antipathetic. Greer himself, in answer to my direct inquiries, had told me that Julia and he had stumbled on it during their honeymoon, and Julia had fallen in love with it. Had felt drawn to it at once, which was singular enough since, as perhaps you know, the old house was all a ruin, and to me at least, depressing. Julia, in her own sweet way, so bright and vivacious in the early days of our acquaintance, told several of us one night at dinner there, some time before midsummer, that when she first laid eyes on the house, she had a queer feeling that all the doors and windows opened to her, and that something really called to her from within to come and live and be happy there.
Yes,
she went on, her bright eyes glowing.
Be happy there. Why, it sang to me, really sang as I went towards it, like a...
I forget her word, but I remember the radiance in her eyes as she looked towards her husband, and how his eyes gave back her look. Later on, when, once more, not wholly casually, I asked him about the house, I remember he said, "To tell the truth, I didn't feel drawn to it, as Julia felt. But to be able to give my wife the one thing she desired above all others, it really took hold of her, and to be able to give it to her and please her. My God, Pierre, the joy of doing that. I say the strange, strange joy." There you have it. Why strange? I don't mean anything about the old house, but that intensity in his love for Julia which, I say again, stimulated in the subconscious of their friends the apprehension of menaces to their happiness in those black shadows under the hemlocks. I never bought but one house, and that we bought on paper. If, however, in the flush of our honeymoon, Annette and I had stumbled on one already made, and the doors and windows had flown open to her, and the sweet spirits had, as it were, sung her in, well, I suppose I should never have lost faith in my bride's reason. One can hardly imagine anything more dreadful than that for a honeymoon experience, but I'd have got her damned quick out of the sight of such a lunatic place, and I might have set fire to it into the bargain. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 2. "No, dear," I said to Annette that night we came from dining with a surprisingly happy bachelor, Julia. "I found out nothing more about the house. Some time before, I may add here, we had gleaned from an old storekeeper in Stanton, within the bounds of which it stood, that it had been built for a summer house by an eccentric old man, very religious, Morgan Snart by name. We thought the name had an evil sound, but the old fellow had been apparently more than respectable, and he had not been near the place for many years before he died, not, at any rate, since his daughter, Huldah, had married. Huldah was dead, too, had died just on top of her father, according to the old storekeeper. She had taken to religion even more entirely than her father had, and he guessed from what he had heard the village people say, she had seen the light powerful strong. Though the memory of them was rather drab, they were holy enough. As Annette said, they were too good to be denied heaven, and must have been wholly folded up in bliss, a conclusion disappointing to us who were given to thinking that the errant, damned soul of at least a murderer must be haunting the place. I was rather puzzled to have my wife bring up the subject of the house again. We had come to accept the fact that Julia and Eric loved it, even though we didn't, and thinking of this, I asked Annette abruptly whatever had set her to suspecting the house again.
"Oh, nothing," she replied thoughtfully. "I wasn't suspecting. Julia's been so attached to it, and what you said about Eric's leaving her in such a gloomy place, I suppose. I wonder, Pierre, if you and I are... You remember Cousin Giles thought it was a charming old place. Perhaps we're not educated to see in those old places what other people see. Let's get some books on architecture and read it up, and then our eyes will be opened. Of course, I shouldn't think for a moment of bringing up my children in such an unsanitary old shanty. I can't help it. I think it's damp and horrid and gloomy. There now."
"Heavens, Annette," I cried, turning to face her. "What's the matter?" I knew that she was quite stirred up about something. Usually she was gracious enough to refer to Nettie and little Bobby as our children.
"Oh, nothing,"
she said again, with the airy inflection women use when they think it hardly necessary to take their husbands into their confidence. "Nonsense," I replied firmly but kindly. "Something's made you mad." She turned surprised round eyes at me. "It has, too," I went on.
"Why, Pierre," she said, innocent as a lamb, "just because I suggest that we improve our minds."
"But what," I asked, surer than ever, "made you think of such a thing?"
"Well, it could be done, couldn't it? Do you think, dear, that I am not naturally ambitious?"
This with supreme pity.
"Do you think that I do not want the best for my children and myself? And you, dear, if there's something in architecture more than we think, we ought to get busy and learn about it. Cousin Giles tells me that my sense of beauty is undeveloped. Heaven knows what he'd say about yours, dear. But he's in the family, and I don't mind him."
"Now we'll get to the heart of this," I said, smiling.
"It's nothing to get to the heart of," Annette went on serenely. "It's simply that old house. I told Julia I thought it a horrid old place." "Annette!" "Well, not baldly like that, of course. It was when we came. I invited Julia to come and stay with us while Eric's away. You know," I said, "we have a nice sunny spare room, and I think it would do you much more good than to stay shut up in a gloomy old house like this."
"Well, that was going some, and then?"
"She was very top-lofty."
"No," I interrupted. "Not top-lofty, not Julia."
"Yes, Pierre. Will you let me finish? I tell you, she was very top-lofty." "Oh," she said, just like that. "So you find this house a gloomy, shut-up old place?" And since I'd gone that far, I wasn't going to take anything back, and I came out flat and told her I thought it was horrid. Then she said, 'But I love it. Thank you 1,000 times for asking me to stay with you while Eric's gone. You mustn't think, though, that this house is lonesome.' She gave quite a queer little laugh, and then she told me that it was a sweet old place. 'And,' she said, 'you don't think after all that Eric and I've done with it that I want to leave it for a single night, do you? I know some of the rooms are shady, but you wouldn't have me drive from our nest by a shadow, would you?' She got quite excited, so I said I only thought our house would be more cheerful for her in Eric's absence, and I admitted that I didn't see in her old place what she saw in it, and she just turned her back on me and said, 'I suppose not.'"
"Not like that," I cried, for Annette had given the little remark a most disagreeable, almost an insolent ring.
"Yes, Pierre," Annette replied with something like indignation. "She was very sharp and rather snobbish. I know Julia's artistic and all that, but goodness knows, though I may be only a plain practical woman, I'm not a country know-nothing, and she has no right to put on airs with me just because I don't happen to see in her old house what she sees in it."
I say frankly that little else could have made me sorrier than to have my wife fall out with Julia Greer. I've never met two persons to whom I have been so drawn as to Eric and Julia Greer. And I've heard Annette say the same thing for her part. They were so good-looking and so generous, and they had such warm voices. While I felt much the same as Annette about their house, I could not help confessing that, compared with them, Annette and I were, well, not ordinary, but not extraordinary either. It is, of course, only fair to Annette to remind you that the distinguished artist, Giles Farrow, was her cousin, not mine. For my part, I could name perhaps 6 colors and could recognize the names of twice as many more. But tones, shades, and tints? Not that Julia and Eric ever talked of such details with me, but Giles used to talk such stuff with them, and they used to be very much interested in it. So I told Annette that Julia had meant nothing, that the tone might easily be misunderstood, while the words in themselves were entirely innocent. After all, no one but Julia could be expected to see in that house just what Julia saw. Annette let me rave on a while about beauty, and then she asked me if I, too, found beauty in that old house. "Yes," I said valiantly, "a certain beauty. Yes, I do." But I blushed as I said it, and it was so wholly sham, so wholly manly, Annette said, that we both burst out laughing. Suddenly Annette stopped, poised a second, and then fled upstairs in her stocking feet, shouting down at me, "It's raining great guns, and all the windows are open. Go out and bring in the baby carriage." It was raining hard, and the wind was blowing a gale. I got pretty wet hauling the baby carriage backwards to the front porch, but Once there with it, I was sheltered, and I stood there a few moments facing north. The night was absolutely black, for we had as yet no street lights in the outer parts of Forsby. The light from the bulb on the porch behind me, however, lit up the heavy drops of rain that fell from the coping, and down the granolithic pathways I saw long streaks of rain reflect it back now and then like steel. Through all the noise of rain and wind, I just barely heard the whistle of the last train from the city. The tracks were a couple of miles away. 12:30. I went in and locked up the house for the night. Oh, serenity of the sound new house. At every stage of my toilet I thought of it. Our neat, square bedroom, with its window east and its 2 windows south, and all Julia's rooms were queer-shaped. Our tiled bathroom, with its white enamel, its shining nickel, its open plumbing. And I don't believe Eric had a bit of shining nickel or open plumbing in his whole place. Our electric light beside the beds and over the mirror and everywhere one might want it, and their dingy gas and flickering candles. My thoughts went on as I brushed my teeth over the bright nickel toothbrush basin. The sanitary equipment of our house was up to date and complete as it always should be in a house that shelters young children. If the Greers had children, now, it wouldn't be so lonesome over there. But they'd have to clear the place up more, cut down those rotten old trees and let the sun in all day, all around. Funny, Julia was as merry as a lark this evening, and looked as she looked the first day I saw her, before the summer had, well, pulled her down, I guess. And she was as fresh and sparkling as the sun on a brook.
"Aren't you ever coming to bed?"
Annette called to me. I snapped off the light and went into the bedroom. As I opened the window, the wind roared in, flapped my pajamas about my legs, and hurled the rain halfway across the floor. "Say, Annette, I don't know about opening this window."
"Come along, the other'll be just as bad, and we'll mop up the floor in the morning. Roll the rug back, dear, and come to bed."
That for good tight floors. I got into bed and then snapped out the little table lamp, with rose-colored shade, right beside me. The room was instantly in darkness, but I was safe in bed. Better than dingy gas and flaring candles, eh, old girl? I reached out my hand from the bed for hers that, sleepy as she might be or dark the room, never failed to find mine and bridge the little space between our beds in a good-night clasp.
"Just the same," she murmured sleepily, "I'm going to study architecture till I see in that house what Julia sees."
I chuckled and pressed her hand. "That you'll never do, my love. Good night." I'll never forget how Annette pulled on my hand when, at that very moment, a banging on the front door resounded through the house. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 3. As I have told you, our house has every modern convenience. We have electric doorbells at every door, but whoever gave those resounding thwacks, they seemed resounding, I assure you, at that weird hour of the night and in that storm, was probably unable in the dark to find the button. So my mind reasoned in a second or two. You know, pounding on a door is a very threatening noise, and I confess I was startled. Annette was really alarmed. For a long while she would not loose my hand, but kept dragging at me, and I was very awkward trying to find the button of the lamp to my left. Once a little light in the room, however, she became cautious and alert. She would not let me leave my bed. Both of us sat up, and, very strained, we listened for the blows to come again. It seemed a long time that we waited. It was probably not more than a couple of minutes. At any rate, no sound but the roaring of the wind, the driving of the rain, and the flapping of the curtain by the open window assailed our ears. Suddenly I jumped out of bed, and, determined to find who had roused us so, made my way without slippers or gown into the northeast room, from the window of which I could lean out and spy. I didn't switch on any light because, as Annette said, that would have made me too good a target for anyone below. As I stumbled along, I heard my little son begin to cry, an unusual sound in our house and disconcerting at that hour. From the north window I could see nothing in the blackness of the night. I opened it cautiously, without making a sound, and leaned out. The very wall of the house beneath me was invisible. I might have been leaning over an unfathomable abyss. But through the noise of rain and wind, my ear caught the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, on the granolithic walk. "Who's there?" I challenged loudly. To my utter amazement, the voice which answered me, hushed but audible from out of the storm, was familiar.
Pierre, I got you up. I'm sorry I watched your light from half a mile down the road, hoping it would not go out. I was just going on."
"For the love of heaven, Eric," I shouted back. "I'll be down in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail." Darting back to my room for my slippers, I switched on the living room lights from upstairs, and then I rushed down to let him in. He stepped over the threshold, dripping wet. I saw in a glance that his clothes were soaked through. They hung down heavily from his shoulders. I caught a glimpse, too, of a heavy dress suit case he left outside on the porch. "What's the matter, Eric?" I asked him, more than ever surprised to see standing before me a man I had thought was 1,000 miles away.
"Nothing's the matter," he replied in his melodious and somewhat sad voice.
He took off his hat with an apologetic sidelong smile. The rain ran in streams from it.
"I didn't mean to rout you out, but somehow it's such a devilish night, and I wanted to get home quickly."
"There's nothing the matter with Julia, is there?" I asked suddenly and without thinking.
"With Julia?"
he cried, his look transfixing me, and his deep-set brown eyes terribly anxious and searching. "I am an idiot. Of course not. We left her not 2 hours ago. Never saw her looking so well. Never saw her livelier." That relieved him. He undid a button or two of his coat. I always noticed how lean and sensitive his hands were, and reached in for a handkerchief to mop his face. What an expressive wet face it was. He cleared his throat, putting his fingers to his mouth as he did so in a gesture characteristically apologetic. He was a tall, wiry, gaunt fellow, whose face fairly burned with eagerness at times, though he was a man of few words, rather mute. I suppose he was self-effacing, and extremely considerate of others rather than apologetic. Certainly there was no suggestion of weakness about him. He wasn't assertive or aggressive, but he had unusual power of endurance, both physical and, I found out later, mental. Weeks afterwards, Giles said of him that he was tempered in a white-hot resentment, but Giles was an incorrigible phrase-maker. Eric seemed to me just an attractive, magnetic, dark-eyed fellow, taller and thinner than the average and a good deal more what the women call sympathetic. Resentment was the last thing in the world I should have associated with Eric Greer. Well, I am rambling. Eric had never before been in our house without his wife, and I felt as if he were lonesome. All the time my son upstairs kept yelling as if he were scared out of his life. It was like Eric to take upon himself the blame of this, but I deprecated his apologies. One was always doing that with Eric. He told me then that he had found himself in Buffalo with 3 days on his hands, and had determined to take a flying trip to his home and his wife.
"I can't bear being away from her,"
he added, but with no trace of apology there. He burned when he spoke of his wife.
"And it's such a rotten night. I just got into Forsby from New York. There was no cab at the station, and I started to walk it. When I saw the light in your window, I hoped I'd get to your house before you had gone to bed, and that... Well, I have only 36 hours to spend with Julia at the best, and I thought you'd perhaps run me over in your car." He would have driven himself over, but I knew he couldn't manage a Ford very well, and besides I was glad to do him a favor, so I rushed upstairs to dress. There was something abroad in the night that took away all thought of sleep. Even Bobby kept up his whimpering, which was very unlike him. I stopped in his room a second to tell Annette, who was watching with him, that it was Eric who had roused us, and that I was going to run him over in the Ford. She had already assured herself of the nature of our midnight visitor. She thought I was a fool to drive him over in such a storm, that it would be much more sensible to keep him with us overnight. As a matter of fact, she didn't want to be left alone in the house. Bobby had had terrible nightmares. She couldn't wake him up. She thought he had a fever. You know how women are, even the best of them, like my wife. Just the same, I got dressed, forced a dry coat on Eric, cranked up the Ford, and started out in the storm. Eric paid no attention to the roughness of the way. While my mind was wholly intent upon steering the light car through the heavy mud and keeping her out of ruts, he asked me anxious questions about the condition of his wife. Now and then, when we came to a smooth stretch, I would say, you know how, with my mind only half in it, "She's as bright as a cricket. She's improved wonderfully." Or, as a joke, "She seems to thrive on your absence, Eric. I wonder if that pleased him." Perhaps he didn't hear anything I said, with the wind roaring about us. At any rate, he couldn't get enough out of me. He even asked me if she was sleeping better.
What a question from one husband to another. I answered, like a top. I never knew she had slept in any other way. All the way, the rain was bouncing and running all over the windshield and steaming on the engine hood. The wind was trying to tear the top off the car, and the whole shebang was rocking and pitching along the road like a bump the bumps at Coney Island. Even the lights got to playing tricks. From time to time, the rain or something reflected them in a queer way, so that it seemed to me as if a ball of light or a sort of thick string of it were flying along just ahead of us, now just over the engine, now right on the edge of the windshield. It was so queer that it made me jumpy and nervous. I found the next morning that the reflector in the right lamp was broken. That accounted for it simply enough, but I remember how I jumped when we turned down into Eric's driveway in that uncanny light. It was like an eel then, darted ahead of us and round the corner as if it were alive. At Eric's request, I stopped the car under the hemlocks some little way from the house, and as luck would have it, I stalled the engine doing so. That left us in absolute darkness, and it felt and sounded as if the wind and rain doubled their fury. What a friend to man is light. I don't know why I insisted on stumbling along with Eric towards where we knew the house must be if the storm hadn't blown it from the edge of the cliff into the river. We didn't know where to put our feet, and in the darkness the wind sounded like all sorts of unearthly things. Once it was so like an anguished human cry that we both stopped, trembling. I'm not sure now that it wasn't. We kept on going, trying to feel the edge of the driveway with our feet. Of course, we couldn't see a sign of the house. Finally, I said to Eric, "This is absurd. I'll go back and start the engine. That will give us some light, and you've got to wake Julia anyhow." Though he remonstrated, I had already turned when I heard the noise of bolts shot back with a loud click. We were much nearer the house than we knew. The front door was suddenly thrown open, and I saw Julia standing in the doorway. She wore a long white nightgown, and she carried in her hand a lighted candle. She was the only visible thing in the night, save right before me the clear-cut but lightless edge of Eric's face. Behind her there was a sort of rosy glow. She must have lighted a lamp back in the narrow hallway, one wall of which I remembered was hung with a damask of deep rose color. She cried out, "Who's there?" And though she was not more than 10 feet from us, I could hardly hear her voice over the noise of the storm. Eric answered her, almost with a sob, and sprang towards her across the lawn and up the steps. He had her caught up in his arms in a second, and she let the candle fall. In an instant, the night was black again, save for that rosy glow, against which I saw their two figures almost as one, shapeless, yet strangely heroic, like two wanderers standing embraced on the edge of a cliff far above the fires of earth. Slipping and almost falling in the mud, I ran back to my fort. I bumped good and hard into a tree trunk before I got there, but I had her cranked and backing before they could have thought of me, and I doubt if even the glare of my lights over their lawn or the roar of the engine in reverse recalled to their minds that there was such a man as Pierre Smith living in the world. The house was still as death when I got back, and I tried to sneak into bed without a sound. But the wife of my bosom was on a still watch, and in the dark she tried to pump me for all she could get, and that being little for her pains, she fell to thinking that Eric and Julia were both crazy nuts. Not an elegant phrase, but expressive. It was after 2 before I fell asleep. Just drowsing away, I remembered to ask Annette how Bobby was. He had had terrible nightmares, but had dropped off to sleep again as soon as Eric and I had left the house. He had no fever. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 4. All this happened early in September. The weather had been uncertain from the middle of August, and the day after Eric came home was furious with rain and wind. We hadn't a very cheerful breakfast, Annette and I and the children. Felicia had had nightmares too, and had let the eggs burn. But I remember saying to my wife when I got home that night, very wet and tired, that it was sure to blow and rain itself out at last in time for my vacation, which I always took in the fall and which was due to begin the next week. And that's just what happened. After the 14th or 15th of September, we had a 3-week spell of the loveliest weather you can imagine. I always have been lucky on my vacation. But it wasn't the spell of weather, but the visit of Giles to our house, and what he brought with him, or stirred up, that have made that epoch a vivid memory to me, one which has stayed just behind my everyday sense for nearly 4 years. At the time, none of that was so real to me as my enjoyment of the mild fall days, sowing the lawn, setting out bulbs, Annette and I, crocuses, daffodils, squills. She can tell you what they were, though I think it was Giles that set us to doing it. Tinkering with the Ford and polishing it. Days of golf and picnics with the children up the river. It may be temperamental with me, and the word makes me laugh, but I've always found joy just as real as sorrow. More real, indeed. Everything bad that comes to me seems like an unpleasant dream, from which I'm always looking to wake up, whereas when I'm having a good time, I don't want to go to bed at all. Half our sorrows come from an overbalanced mind, and the other half are aggravated by too much thinking on oneself. I went on having a sensible, happy time, while two persons whom I knew intimately were being stretched tighter and tighter on a rack. And not until I was caught in the infernal thing myself had I the slightest suspicion of what was going on. Of course, I heard the gossip, but I didn't heed it, and in our nightly councils I scolded Annette for listening to it and favoring it. As a matter of fact, she countenanced no more of it than appeased her pique at Julia. That was very slight, after all, and pardonable. If you confess with proper humility that you don't see something, and the one to whom you confess it replies with, "No, I suppose not," in a tone you take to mean, "Poor thing, you ought to see it, but you haven't sense enough," or "You aren't refined enough," or "You aren't made of the right stuff," well, it puts you on the lookout for the beam in the other fellow's eye, no matter how much you may admire him. The trouble was, we both see now that Annette misunderstood Julia's meaning entirely. The little remark, if it was anything but a blind, rang with envy rather than with contempt. I used to laugh to see Annette trying to pump her cousin for the latest dope on the arts. All of Annette's family except Giles were good, sensible people like herself, and Giles always remained a freak to them, someone for whom an apology, or at least an explanation, was necessary. I dare say no one of them, save my wife, ever thought to profit by his abilities and take a little schooling at his hands, but she used in those days to ask him questions as if she were humoring him, and entirely nonchalantly, and she quite fooled me. Not until I began to hear queer words of his lingo, such as composition, values, chiaroscura, fall from her own serene lips, did I realize what she was up to. And he must have known it too, and if he gave out anything at all to her, it must have been with utmost carelessness. He didn't care a snap of his finger about our sense of beauty. He knew us for just what we were, pitied us for that, liked us for that, and once confessed to me envied us for that. Which last I take to mean that no one would be an artist if he could help it. But I must say Giles is a fine fellow and a gentleman. He has since died, fighting for France, which he was the first to make me understand would be fighting for the soul of the world. As for the gossip, I had rather pass over it. But since I am going to plunge into the heart of the affair, and must, perforce, confine myself to what either Annette or I actually saw or experienced, I'd better tell you some of the many yarns, so that you will have an idea of how the strange drama impressed the circle of Forsby's best. So far as I can remember, up to the time of Giles' long stay with us, the only thing Forsby had against Eric and Julia, and gossip, you know, is always what you have against the other fellow, was the fact that they live in that gloomy old house. Julia was exceedingly charming. Eric was by contrast reserved. I've already told you that the house was uncanny to most of us. Added to their choice of such a dwelling, their dress, their independent manners, and their way of speech were enough to brand them as different. To be different is, I have observed, invariably blameworthy. And in this case, Eric, naturally, was held to blame. There was something queer about him. I mean, that was the gossip. It never got going very strong. To tell the truth, I think most of us stood a little in awe of him. But during the 6 weeks that followed his dramatic homecoming, it so happened that he was now at home, now off on another trip. And Forsby noticed not only that in the periods of his being at home, Julia was pale and depressed and didn't appear often on the links of the Caraway Club in Stanton, but that when he was away, she brightened up in appearance and manners and played golf almost every day. Well, Giles was with her a very great deal during the days and sometimes weeks that Eric was away. They used to play golf together and to take long walks together, and he was almost every afternoon at her house for tea, whether Eric was at home or not. It wasn't surprising that the ladies began to whisper among themselves, nor was it surprising that they came to the decision that Giles was in love with Julia, that Julia glad of Giles' company, that everything wasn't peaches and cream in the Greer household. But let it go. The saddest part of it was that Eric at one time probably heard some of it. He was so sensitive that it didn't take much of a hint to make him worry. Yet, as I've already told you, he could never have doubted Julia's love for him. Now to go back to my story. It must have been a Friday night that Eric came home so unexpectedly from his first trip away. Though he told me that he had only 36 hours to pass at home with his wife, he did not leave until Monday morning. This I remember because early Monday morning I telephoned Julia I was going down to the train station from New York to meet Giles, from whom we had received a telegram the night before. I wanted to see Julia, and I thought that perhaps I might give her a lift along the road somewhere, or take some letter down to the station for her. Besides, the Ford was working wonderfully well that morning. You understand, we had seen nothing of Eric or Julia since that Friday night. They were at that time so wrapped up in each other that we should not have thought of breaking in on them. To my surprise, Eric answered the telephone, and it was he who was glad of a chance to be taken to the station. There was a train down to New York just before Giles's train up from there was due. Eric was leaving on that, so I hustled over for him in the Ford. It was a wonderful morning. The shadows under the hemlocks by Eric's house were the only dark things I saw, and I always felt rather than saw them. Eric was waiting for me on the steps to the front door, with his bags at his feet. Julia was standing beside him, heavily veiled.
"Will you be good enough to take me along, too?" she asked, in an unusually low voice. "I want to go with Eric as far as I can."
And Eric added with great tenderness, "I want her to have a lot of this sweet, fresh air." "Then for heaven's sake, take off that thick veil, Julia," I cried. "It's a gorgeous day. Don't shut it out. There's no dust. The roads are still wet." "Do, my dear," Eric urged. "No one will see that mark. All the black and blue spots in the world wouldn't make any difference to me or to anyone." She stood beside him. I was going to say trembling. I never saw Julia tremble while she had strength enough to stand on her feet, but there was something about her that morning suggestive of extreme weakness, and I had a feeling of uncertainty about her health. "Have you had a fall, Julia?" I asked anxiously. "The silly girl walked in her sleep last night," Eric explained, "and bumped her cheek." In the way of a joke, I shouted, "Oh, you Lady Macbeth!" I had a moment's pride of my knowledge of Shakespeare. But Julia put her hand up in protest. "Don't say that," she cried. "I've done nothing I can think of." I could see that I had upset her. "All right, Julia," I said. "I'll take your word for it. Only, please take off that funeral crepe and enjoy the morning sunshine. There's nothing better than cool, fresh air for the black and blue spots." That was a fatuous remark, but it pleased Eric. We could not persuade Julia to lift her veil, however. In her simple gray frock she looked like a girl but for the wretched black drapery about her head, a device which, in my eyes, always gives women the appearance of victims going to the block to have their heads cut off. Not one word did either of them say to or for me as I drove them through flat Forsby to the station that morning, but I heard their low, affectionate voices all the way. That was a pleasant sound, and together with the golden September weather, the early morning sun, and the clean-washed air, drove from my mind the thought it had harbored for a moment that this Julia was not the merry Julia of our little Friday night dinner. I remember a shock at the station, however. They were greatly upset at parting, much as they controlled themselves, and I left them standing on the platform and stepped to my car just alongside. As the train came in, she threw up her veil to take his kiss, and then I caught a glimpse of her face. Anguish at parting might have taken the blood from her cheeks, but when after the train had pulled out of the station she came towards me, her veil still lifted, I saw she was haggard as well as pale. Tears were in her eyes. Just a step or two, she appeared uncertain in her movement, and then she set her lips and came forward staunchly. She ignored the hand I offered to help her into the car, and without even looking at me stepped in and took her seat calmly. I saw the mark, high on the right cheekbone, the discoloration spreading up under the outer corner of the eye. She had forgotten about her veils being lifted. Indeed, I now know that she wore it to hide her face from Eric only. Up to the final scene, it remained her greatest care to conceal from Eric, as far as she could, the signs of her suffering, the nature of which she had determined he must not know. After a while she blew her nose a little, coughed, and then turned her moist gray eyes to meet my too anxious look. "How
Foolish I am to love him so, she said, smiling a little. In the few minutes we had to wait for Giles's train, we said nothing. She was completing the mastery over herself. From time to time I stole a glance at her sweet, determined little face. After her tears had ceased to flow, she sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap and devoted herself more and more to her own thoughts, no detail of which was recorded on the sensitive white mask of her face. Under her breast and throat I saw waves of emotion rise and fall, but her firm lips were locked against the force of them. It was a relief to hear Giles's train come rumbling into the station. We were waiting on the inbound side. After the train had pulled out, I saw Giles on the other platform across the tracks. He had a couple of heavy bags at his feet, and he was looking irascibly up and down and all around, shouting, "Porter!" at men on our side of the rails, pointing his cane at them, behaving as he usually behaves, as if the whole world were reprehensibly indifferent to him, and he wouldn't put up with it much longer.